The engine of the military's newest, most sophisticated battle tank sputtered to a halt during a live demonstration. A team of 3 engineers tried their best, but none of them could get it to work. Then, someone brought up the name of someone long forgotten. Surrounded by the smell of hot metal and the sound of wrenches turning, he didn't just fix an engine. He revived a piece of his own history. Meet David Calloway, or just Dave, a quiet genius when it comes to machines. Dave didn't have a fancy education. Raised in an unstable household, he spent most of his childhood in various foster homes, always drawn to the way things ticked and clicked. From a young age, if something broke, he'd take it apart and put it back together, sometimes better than before. At just 12, he fixed the rusted boiler system at the group home where he lived. His talent for mending things was apparent early on. By 18, he enlisted in the military, looking for a way out of the hard life he'd grown up with. He wasn't a man of many words, but on base, everyone knew who to call when machinery malfunctioned, especially in the middle of nowhere. While others followed manuals, Dave had an instinct for understanding the heart of a broken engine. Some called it a gift, others called it luck. He just thought of it as doing his job, quietly and effectively. At 66, Dave carries the weight of 2 lives: his difficult childhood and his time in the military, which ended abruptly in 1980 after a freak accident during an experimental tank engine test. A blast left shards of metal embedded in his leg and invisible scars that would haunt him for years. His pension barely covered medical expenses, and the surgeries drained his savings. A few years later, his wife left him, unable to cope with his new reality. As life became harder, Dave sold his home and moved into a small place to make ends meet. These days, Dave spends his time fixing tractors and construction equipment around rural Nevada. Every morning, he drives his old rusted truck down gravel roads, with his trusty toolbox by his side. The locals know him, the old man with the limp and steady hands. He's not one for small talk, preferring to focus on the task at hand. His silence isn't awkward, it's just how he works. When something breaks, it somehow always calls for him. He lives alone in a modest cabin behind an abandoned repair shop, a place that offers him enough space to breathe and nothing more. To Dave, the noises of engines, every grind, every whir, every sputter, are a language he understands better than anything else. It's the language of his existence, and it gives him purpose. On a particularly quiet Monday, as Dave was fixing a hydraulic issue on a neighbor's old tractor, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Mr. Calloway? This is General Morgan from Base Phoenix. We need your help urgently." Dave chuckled softly. It had been years since anyone had addressed him so formally. "I think you have the wrong person, General," he replied. "No, we've got the right person. You're David Calloway, former mechanic with the Army Corps, correct?" For a moment, there was only silence. Dave wiped his grease-covered hands on his jeans and thought about hanging up. But something in the general's tone made him hesitate. The urgency, the old familiarity, it tugged at something deep within him. An hour later, Dave was heading down the highway toward Base Phoenix. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the dusty roads as he drove. It had been over 2 decades since he had last stepped onto a military base, and the familiar sights brought back a rush of memories, both good and bad. His heart beat a little faster as he neared the base, a mix of curiosity and something else, a deep, aching nostalgia. He parked near the entrance gate, took a deep breath, and grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed. The soldier at the gate, barely out of his teens, looked at him with an expression that could have been surprise or suspicion. His gaze lingered on Dave's worn boots, faded jeans, and the battered toolbox that had seen better days. "Name?" the soldier asked, checking his clipboard. "David Calloway," Dave said, his voice steady. "I was called in by General Morgan." The young soldier frowned. "There's no David Calloway listed for today." Dave remained calm, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He had learned long ago that offering too many explanations only made things more complicated in situations like this. "Could you confirm with the general while I wait?" he asked the young soldier. The soldier hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone. The conversation was brief, punctuated with a few "yes, sir," and "understood, sir." When he hung up, his expression had changed just slightly. The general's in a meeting. The soldier said, "Sergeant Anderson will escort you." 2 minutes later, a tall, no-nonsense man appeared at the entrance. "Mr. Calloway, I'm Sergeant Anderson. The general sent me to take you to Hangar 8. Without saying much more, they walked across the sprawling base, moving through the hallways with a purposeful silence. Dave noticed the curious glances of the younger soldiers, their whispered conversations quieting as they passed. Sergeant Anderson maintained a slightly faster pace, pushing Dave to keep up despite the limp in his right leg. "You work for a defense contractor?" Sergeant Anderson asked without looking at him. Dave paused, then answered, "I handle maintenance work." Anderson nodded, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Dave could sense the skepticism behind the question. He had seen that look before, the kind you get when someone wonders how much value an old mechanic can really add to something so advanced. When they arrived at Hangar 8, Dave's eyes immediately locked on the large, half-covered military vehicle in the center. It was one of the new hybrid combat tanks, the kind he had only seen in blueprints years ago. Around it, 3 engineers in white lab coats were hunched over the exposed engine, their voices tinged with frustration. As Sergeant Anderson and Dave approached, one of the engineers, a middle-aged man with a shaved head, looked up. "Sergeant, is this the specialist?" The tone wasn't outright rude, but it carried a heavy dose of doubt. "This is Dave Calloway," Sergeant Anderson said. The bald engineer wiped his hands on a rag and extended one to Dave. "Dr. Langston, lead engineer on the project. Honestly, we weren't expecting someone a bit more modern," he added with a thin smile, clearly alluding to Dave's graying hair and worn clothes. Dave shook his hand, but didn't engage in any pleasantries. His attention was already fixed on the engine before him, a marvel of technology. Some parts were familiar, while others looked far more advanced than anything he had ever worked on. "What's the issue?" Dave asked, his voice low. "This is a hybrid stealth engine designed to reduce heat and noise on the battlefield," Langston explained. "But there's a major flaw. It loses power after about 15 minutes of operation. We've gone through all the electronics, sensors, fuel systems, and cooling systems. Nothing's worked. Then, someone mentioned your name. Time's running out." Dave stepped closer to the engine, his hands instinctively reaching for areas he knew to check first. He could feel the engineer's eyes on him, their impatience radiating from behind. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked quietly. Langston waved a hand in the air. "Sure, but we've had 5 different specialists working on this already. We spent days on diagnostics. This isn't a simple fix." Without responding, Dave opened his toolbox and pulled out a small flashlight and a mechanical stethoscope, an old-school device that most young techs would scoff at. He began to inspect the engine carefully, ignoring the whispered comments behind him. "Is he really using that?" One engineer muttered under his breath. Another one replied, "Maybe we should explain that this isn't a 1950s truck. It's cutting-edge hybrid tech." Dave continued to methodically inspect the engine for 20 minutes, listening for subtle sounds, checking connections, and feeling for any signs of malfunction that no one else seemed to notice. Finally, he stopped at a specific section of the engine and stood motionless, lost in thought. "Did you find something?" Langston asked, his voice growing impatient. Dave slowly closed his toolbox and turned to face the engineers. "The problem's not with the engine itself," he said calmly. "What do you mean?" Langston asked, eyebrows furrowing. "It's in the system integration," Dave replied. "There's a micro-vibration in the mounting base. It only shows up once the engine heats up and expands. This thermal-induced vibration is causing harmonic dissonance, which throws off the synchronization between the combustion engine and the electric drive." The 3 engineers exchanged glances, clearly taken aback. "Mr. Calloway," Langston said, his tone slower now, "with all due respect, that's not possible. We've already tested the mounting bases thoroughly." "Did you test them at room temperature?" Dave asked, his voice calm but firm. The silence that followed was all the answer Dave needed. He didn't wait for them to speak. "Did you check the vibration dampers?" he continued. The engineer with glasses glanced at his clipboard. "The dampers are within factory specifications." "Factory specs are designed for conventional engines," Dave countered. This hybrid system generates a different vibration pattern. The issue only appears once the system gets up to full heat. Static diagnostics miss it. Langston folded his arms. Mr. Calloway, with all due respect, that sounds like guesswork. We need concrete data. Dave nodded. He grabbed his toolbox and began walking toward the door. Where are you going? Sergeant Anderson asked, blocking his path. You don't need me anymore. You already know more than I do, Dave said. He left the hangar without haste, his silhouette slightly leaning to the right as he walked, the familiar ache in his leg reminding him of the past. Behind him, the three engineers stood in silence, watching him leave the hangar. Dave sat in his truck, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't feel angry, just the same kind of exhaustion he'd become used to over the years. The guy everyone overlooked until they had no other choice but to turn to him. And even then, they'd prefer to believe it was a stroke of luck rather than acknowledge his skills. Hours later, as he was washing dishes after dinner, his phone rang. It was Langston again, but this time the tone was different. Mr. Calloway, this is Dr. Langston. I owe you an apology. You were right. We tested the mounting base after prolonged heat exposure and found the micro vibration in the dampers exactly as you described. Dave dried his hands slowly, a small sigh escaping him. I need you to come back, Langston continued. General Morgan would like to speak with you in person. The next day, Dave returned to Hangar 8. But this time, everything felt different. The tense, skeptical air from yesterday was gone, replaced with something almost respectful. Langston was waiting, accompanied by a man in full military uniform. Dave recognized him immediately by his insignia, General Morgan. Mr. Calloway, the general said, extending his hand. I owe you an apology for how you were treated yesterday. No need, General, Dave replied, his tone steady. Yes, there is, General Morgan insisted. Dr. Langston explained everything. He also told me you identified a flaw that our team couldn't detect in an entire week. Mr. Calloway, the engine you inspected is built on principles you helped develop over 40 years ago. The mounting dampers you flagged as faulty were originally designed using your own specifications. The room fell silent. Langston and the other engineers exchanged uneasy glances. Dave could feel their eyes on him now, but there was no judgment in them, only acknowledgement. Sergeant Calloway, General Morgan said, using Dave's military rank for the first time. May I ask why one of the architects of the military hybrid propulsion program, someone who just saved a multi-million-dollar project, is working outside our system? Dave had been expecting this question for years. It was the one he'd never known how to answer without sounding like he was just making excuses. But today, he didn't hesitate. There was an accident during testing, sir, back in '80. I was blamed for it and ended up with a permanent injury to my leg. After that, they saw me as a liability. I understand, the general said quietly. Langston stepped forward, visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Calloway, I sincerely apologize. Dave gave a small nod. Don't worry about it, Doctor. General Morgan stepped closer, his voice low but earnest. Sergeant, may I make a proposal? We have other projects facing serious challenges. Would you be willing to come back into the fold? Dave shook his head, a gentle but firm refusal. I appreciate the offer, General, but that chapter's behind me. That's not who I am anymore. Morgan paused for a moment, then said, with all due respect, Sergeant, you have a gift. You always have, but I respect your decision. The general reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Dave. Then allow me to make one more proposal. This is to cover the service you've provided and the recognition you should have received all those years ago. Dave didn't take the envelope right away. He looked at it, then glanced up at the general. I didn't do it for that, sir. I know, General Morgan replied quietly. That's exactly why you deserve more than what's in this envelope. Dave took the envelope, slipping it into his jacket pocket without opening it. He cast one last look at the hybrid tank at the far end of the hangar. The artificial lights now reflected off its sleek panels. There was no noise, no shaking, no failure. Just quiet, just peace. The next morning, Dave was finishing up an adjustment on a John Deere 5E Series tractor when he heard tires crunching on the dirt road. A black SUV pulled up near the barn. Dr. Langston stepped out, leaning against the SUV's bumper as the morning sun cast a sharp light across his face. "Sergeant," Langston began, "I had to come here to tell you something in person." Dave wiped his hands slowly, not hurried. "Of course, Doctor. What's on your mind?" Langston took a deep breath. "When you identified that micro-vibration, I felt small." Dave didn't react, instead focusing on the horizon where the desert met the sky. He picked up a rag and continued wiping his hands at his own pace. "I felt small," Langston repeated, "because I've always considered myself smart, maybe even better than others. But clearly I was wrong. I've spent years surrounded by experts, PhDs, engineers, young minds with diplomas hanging on the wall. But none of them had the sensitivity you showed in that hangar. You heard something no one else could hear." Dave continued, wiping his hands, his movements calm and deliberate. "Learning has everything to do with listening with humility. Machines always give a warning when something's off, but not everyone has the patience or the humility to listen to someone who does." Langston lowered his head, thoughtful. He took a deep breath and then reached out, shaking Dave's hand one last time. It was a gesture of gratitude, but also of something else, something deeper. As Langston drove off down the dirt road in his SUV, Dave stood there, watching him go. Between two worlds. A man who had quietly proven that a person's true value isn't lost. It simply waits for the right moment to be rediscovered by those wise enough to listen and look beyond the surface.